It's impossible to know exactly what was going on in the minds of the writers of the Bill of Rights hundreds of years ago when they crafted it, but we do know that the Bill of Rights was created to protect citizens from the federal government due to worries about potentially repeating the issues created by the British monarchy. What that means is that the First Amendment only exists to protect citizens from government overreach. The First Amendment is worded as such: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Note that not only is the First Amendment explicitly about limits imposed on the government, the First Amendment concerns the freedom of religion, the freedom of the press, the freedom of assembly, the freedom to petition your government, and the freedom of speech. Most Americans don't know the specific wording of the First Amendment off the top of their head, if at all, so its emphasis on Congress often goes unacknowledged, despite being incredibly important, as wording in law always is. The First Amendment does not protect anyone from social backlash, nor does it protect from school or career consequences. There are laws against discrimination on the basis of national origin, race, color, religion, disability, sex, and familial status, but those laws are not part of the First Amendment. Being fired from one's job for expressing beliefs that damage the company image, that go against the company mission, or that create a space that is harmful to one's coworkers is neither a violation of free speech, nor is it inherently discriminatory. Organizations like the ACLU have often been criticized for defending the speech of neo-Nazis, KKK members, and the like. Their defense is that by defending the speech of those kinds of people, they are defending all speech, which isn't necessarily untrue, but also isn't completely true, because, contrary to common sentiments, freedom of speech has almost never in American history been absolute, though because of the importance placed on the First Amendment, not just by the public but also by the law and the courts, what speech is punishable has become narrower and narrower over the years. The Bill of Rights, obviously including the First Amendment, was ratified in 1791, though contrary to popular belief, it was only reluctantly ratified, purely done so to appease the states that were not confident that the Constitution as written would do enough to prevent government overreach. Even then, it had been whittled down from 20 amendments to 10. The actual writers of the Constitution were not the staunch believers in free speech that some make them out to be. And in fact, the First Amendment being the First Amendment is a complete coincidence and not an indicator of its importance. Relevant to that, 7 years later, in 1798, the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed, the latter of which were explicit restrictions on free speech. As detailed by the National Archives,
in 1978, the United States stood on the brink of war with France. As a result, a Federalist-controlled Congress passed 4 laws, known collectively as the Alien and Sedition Acts. These laws raised the residency requirements for citizenship, authorized the president to deport aliens, and permitted their arrest, imprisonment, and deportation during wartime. The Sedition Act made it a crime for American citizens to print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, and malicious writing about the government. Sedition Act trials, along with the Senate's use of its contempt powers to suppress dissent, set off a firestorm of criticism against the Federalists and contributed to their defeat in the election of 1800, after which the acts were repealed or allowed to expire.
It only took 7 short years for the ratification of the right to freedom of speech for it to receive its first limits in American law. They were harmful restrictions and undone relatively quickly, but even so it makes it blatantly clear that consequences to speech that is considered harmful or a high risk is not some new phenomenon. And that's before we even start talking about social consequences rather than legal consequences. As American law has changed, other restrictions have been introduced. These few narrow categories of speech that are not protected from government restrictions include incitement, defamation, fraud, obscenity, child pornography, intellectual property violations, fighting words, and true threats. Some of you may be surprised to learn that there are not, nor have there ever been, laws against hate speech in America. Nor does the rhetoric often accused of being hate speech necessarily fall under the categories above that you may think, such as fighting words, true threats, or defamation. The law is basically a completely different language from regular English, So the definition of something like true threats or fighting words does not mean the same legally as it does colloquially. Despite there being a definition set by the European Union, there is no agreed-upon definition of hate speech in America, in part due to concerns about evolving language. A term that might count as hate speech today might not in a few years, or vice versa. It also might register as hate speech to some, and not others. Dog whistles are even harder to manage legally, since they are by their nature obfuscating the real meaning behind them. The First Amendment also protects hyperbolic language, which many instances of what might be considered hate speech could easily be argued to be. For some issues, such as harmful speech that are very complex, American courts develop tests that are used going forward to weigh whether something violates a law. In this context, we are looking at the limits that can be placed on speech by the government as legal terms. That means that what the common person believes should fall under these categories, and what these categories actually include legally, are not always the same thing. And as mentioned, this disparity between the colloquial and legal definitions of the same term is often where a lot of the discourse gets very messy, particularly as it pertains to those tests, due to them getting narrower over time. During World War I, in developments not so different from the ones Americans have been going through since 2016, and then in particular since 2020, the American people began to question and challenge a lot of the political and societal structures they felt were causing injustice in the United States. There were political movements that promoted socialism, communism, feminism, racial justice, and movements that objected to military drafts and war in its entirety. Often, there was overlap between these movements as well. This is when the Espionage Act of 1917 was passed, which prohibited obtaining and disseminating information or documents related to national defense that could be used against the United States, and made it criminal for anyone to obstruct enlistment in the military. After the creation of this new limit on free speech came a case known as Schenck versus the United States. The socialists Charles Schenck and Dr. Elizabeth Baer had been distributing information that objected to the draft, and because America was at war, at that moment, this became considered dangerous speech. In Schenck versus the United States, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes created what is known as the clear and present danger test. The argument behind this test is that critical and provocative speech is protected, but speech that advocates for something that could likely lead to immediate danger is not. Objecting to the draft outside of wartime would likely have been permitted, but during war, it was considered too high a risk. This case is where the famous metaphor of falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater comes from, though it wasn't exactly a metaphor at the time, as there were actual stampedes that killed people. The clear and present danger test was most impactfully used in a case in 1927 against a woman named Anita Whitney, a feminist, suffragist, and pacifist, advocating for racial equality and part of the Communist Labor Party, which had long-lasting ramifications on free speech law. As lawyer and law professor with expertise in the First Amendment Marianne Franks and NPR host Ramtin Arubale discuss on an episode of NPR's podcast Throughline.
In 1927, when the Supreme Court upheld the conviction of Anita Whitney for helping to organize the Communist Labor Party, it set a precedent that would remain in place for decades. States could punish people who use speech that tends to incite crime, disturb the public peace, or threaten to overthrow the government by unlawful means.
Clarence Brandenburg is a KKK leader who calls up a reporter and says, you should film everything that happens at this rally. And at this rally, he's in full Klan regalia speaking to all of these other hooded individuals and says, if the white race continues to be oppressed by the president and Congress and the Supreme Court, we may have to take, and he calls it revengeance. They're carrying weapons. They're using anti-Black, anti-Semitic slurs. It's pretty clear that it's meant to be threatening and intimidating. And the broadcast of the speech is not just played on local news, but it makes national news, so everybody really has the chance to hear it. He's convicted for this speech under the Ohio statute, and it goes up to the Supreme Court, and you get the opposite result. So what they give you in the Brandenburg case is a different test. Now we have a test of imminent lawless action. Yeah. You can't prohibit people's speech unless the speaker intended really to incite imminent lawless action. That is, pretty much has to happen immediately, and it has to be really likely that that lawlessness is going to happen. So it's a really, really narrow view of what you're allowed to prohibit under the First Amendment.
While this new test has absolutely allowed abhorrent speech to gain tremendous ground in public discourse, such as that of the KKK, it must be understood that this test has also protected many leftists who have been openly stating preferences for communism or socialism, as well as anyone who has expressed a belief that political violence, either as self-defense against the rising fascist movement or as a tool for addressing embedded societal inequities, may be necessary. All this to say, cracking down on speech is extremely risky. There are many ways that cracking down can be misused, and a lot of those are unknown to the average American and/or hard for them to understand. As Marianne Franks discusses in her book The Cult of the Constitution, however, this borderline religious protection of free speech has been weaponized just as much as any limits the government has been given permission to impose. While they've always been around, the influence of so-called free speech absolutists has certainly seemed to grow in recent years, and as such, whether the protections of free speech should be absolute or not is often at the center of the issues we're discussing, despite the fact that even the most principled free speech absolutist would likely have limits they wish to impose on speech, such as the creation of child pornography. Though, you might be surprised to know that revenge porn, also known as non-consensual pornography, that is, the sharing of explicit nudity or sexual content of another human being without their consent, has long been defended by self-proclaimed civil rights groups like the ACLU. It's important to understand where the almost religious protection of the First Amendment comes from, which is that the protection of freedom of speech is considered by many to be the protection on which a strong democracy is built for a few different reasons. For example, in principle, it allows for the exchange of ideas that allow the citizens to determine what they believe to be the best direction for the country, and thus determine how to vote. And again, in principle, it allows for the citizens to determine truth through that exchange of ideas, rather than to have the truth determined by partisan forces in the government. Basically, the freedom of expression is the most fundamental right on which all other rights are based. If you can be punished for your freedom of expression, suddenly a lot of things fall apart. The theory that free speech absolutists acting in good faith tend to subscribe to is known as the marketplace of ideas. This theory posits that if all, or at least almost all speech is allowed, so-called bad speech will be countered with so-called better speech. And the public will be able to determine through what speech wins out, which speech is truthful and helpful to society. As the name suggests, it operates on similar faith to the theory of competition that drives unregulated capitalism, in that if you let all the companies compete without regulation, the consumers will determine the best companies and products, and which company makes the best products will come out on top. As has become clear to the majority of the public, unregulated capitalism has only allowed the most powerful, wealthy, and/or malicious people and corporations to dominate, shrink, crush, and/or manipulate the markets they operate in, making the most wealthy shareholders more wealthy, while the public receives products that are worse and worse, yet also more and more expensive. The marketplace of ideas as a theory fails in the same way, with the most powerful, wealthy, and/or malicious people and corporations developing strategies to dominate, control, suppress, and/or manipulate the narrative to their liking through gaming the system via human bias, emotional manipulation, power disparity, and the self-interest of other powerful individuals and corporations. Due to the disregard of all these issues, in practice, free speech absolutism is impossible to implement without becoming a hypocrite. To protect all speech equally means protecting the speech of those using their speech to silence others. Neutral enforcement of law is impossible in a systemically biased society, which is why, to give more attention to the groups that have been historically prevented from accessing the majority of their constitutional rights via diversity and inclusion efforts, is not giving those groups extra rights, protections, or privileges, simply addressing what was preventing them from accessing what they were already supposed to have access to. An uncomfortably recent example, as in July 2023, less than a year ago at time of writing, of the failure of implementing law without understanding everything I just detailed, was the Supreme Court's decision on the case Counterman versus Colorado. The case concerned a multi-year campaign from Billy Counterman to non-consensually insert himself into singer-songwriter Cole Whalen's life through thousands of messages on social media, including circumventing her blocking of his accounts through finding her on other platforms and making new accounts. Beyond unwanted advances, these messages included, but were not limited to, statements that indicated Counterman was actively watching the defendant offline. While Colorado defined stalking in part as communication that would cause a reasonable person to suffer serious emotional distress, Counterman managed to get his appeal using the First Amendment as a defense up to the Supreme Court, which determined in July 2023 that his speech was constitutionally protected because Counterman did not act recklessly, defined as the accused being aware that others could regard his statements as threatening violence and delivers them anyway.
There were messages where Mr. Counterman would reference details about where she had been or the vehicle she was driving, who she was hanging out with.
Some sounding familiar. I'm going to the store. Would you like anything? Others unsettling. I'm currently unsupervised. I know it freaks me out too, but the possibilities are endless. And the alarming. You're not being good for human relations. Die. Don't need you.
In no uncertain terms, this decision declared stalking as not only legal, but protected under the amendment considered by many to be the most sacred of constitutional rights. This ruling was praised by some who claim to value free speech, including some figures at the ACLU.
Boy, that escalated quickly. I mean, that really got out of hand fast.
It jumped up a notch.
It did, didn't it?
This is, without any doubt, complete hypocrisy. There is no principled defense of free speech taking place when speech and actions that unequivocally and undeniably silence victims through causing extreme distress and even creating implications of immediate danger are declared constitutionally protected. This was, at absolute best, extremely biased and preferential. Even as it's true that tests like Brandenburg have protected many leftists as much as any far-right extremists, the ACLU's history of defending neo-Nazis and KKK members is not so far removed from this either, considering the sole missions of those organizations will inevitably include the suppression of speech from the marginalized groups they target. While it is argued, not without basis, that we must tolerate the existence of speech we find abhorrent in order to prevent weaponized censorship against and criticism of how things are currently run, we cannot ignore that this defense allows for laws that are not simply tolerating abhorrent speech, but actively ignoring the purpose of that speech as an intimidation and silencing tool. Speech that itself is chilling of other speech cannot be countered with so-called better speech, and as such it is impossible to defend the speech of people who silence others with their speech and maintain a sincere and principled mission to protect all speech. Because of this practically sacred treatment of the First Amendment without consideration for the systemic biases and injustices that prevent it from being equally protected for the most marginalized people in society, a unique threat has become more and more prevalent in recent years. This threat is known as stochastic terrorism.